Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, part 2 of our Enchanted rose build. Well, when we last left the show, I had finished the second stage of the resin pouring and got it into the pressure pot, and that's pretty much as far as we got. So the first thing we're going to do today, it's about a week later, is we're going to head over, open up that pressure pot, and see how our casting turned out. Boy, that was really suctioned on there. Well, it looks good. It looks nice and clear. I have a little bit of a concern about this line here that's between the two pores, but I think, as I'm looking down, I think that might just be an air bubble that was created between the two pores, and we're going to end up turning this on the lathe, so hopefully I can remove that. But for now, let's get this out of the mold. Well, resin really doesn't stick to plastic, so we should just be able to pop this base off here. The hot glue is going to hold it more than the resin will. I can see it releasing. You can see the air bubbles inside as you're popping it free. Yeah, the hot glue is really holding that on there. There we go. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to put this in the vise, and I'm very carefully going to use a hacksaw, and we're going to cut this plastic tubing and then break it away from the mold. I decided against the hacksaw and figured that I would probably have more control with my razor saw, so that's what I'm going to be using here. Well, the next step in our process now is I want to take this over to the lathe and we're going to mount it between centers. Well, the way that I've mounted this between centers is I've placed a block of scrap into the 4-jaw chuck, and I've used double-sided tape to adhere it on this one end. I clamped it up for about 5 minutes to give it time to really set in there, and I just have this tailstock live center here just for support until I get this turned round. So that's the first step we're going to do, is we're going to trim this entire cylinder down till it's even and smooth, and hopefully we can get rid of this line and as well our cut line where we took the mold off. Well, I've pretty much got it trued up, and I was able to get rid of that bubble line from where the two pores connected. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to start tapering down this end here, which is the top of the rose. And eventually what we're going to do is turn this so it's a dome. Just take your time, and it's important to make sure that your chisels are sharp, guys. If they're not sharp, you're going to end up with gouges in your resin. So make sure that you give your chisels a good sharpening before you start turning this stuff. Now, every once in a while, you're going to want to stop the lathe and get rid of all this excess resin. It really serves no purpose to spin around like that on there, other than to block your vision, make it so that you can't see what's happening with your turning. And as well, you now have these kind of, well, epoxy whips that are coming back and smacking you in the fingers. So we really don't need that. We don't need the excess material spinning around like that. So just every once in a while, shut the lathe down and clean up the resin strings, if you will. And everyone's safer and happier that way. Well, we had a couple of mishaps, let's call them. First of all, what happened was during turning, the chuck loosened off just a little bit, and that caused one problem. And then while I was trying to straighten out our turning, because now it was wobbly, I ended up getting a catch and breaking it off of our block. So I'm going to try it again. I'm going to put some double-sided tape on there. We're going to try to carefully turn this back around. I don't think you need a video of me repeating all that process. So what I'll do is I'm going to finish shaping this. We're going to make this top part here like a dome shape. And when I'm done, I'll come back and see you, and we'll get into the polishing of this piece. Well, I pretty much have this straightened out now, and I have it sanded using 80 grit sandpaper. I've said this before with turning resins, and I'll say it again. This is the most important sanding step you can do, which is the coarser grits. This is where it'll really show where you have more work to do. And all you need to do to see where your work needs to be improved is once you get this sanded here, run your sandpaper just lightly. I would use maybe a 220 grit, just back and forth, end to end of your piece, all the way around, and the parts that need extra work will pop out at you. So I'm going to do that and see if I can show you what I mean. Can you see this? Can you see this line right here? That line is where we need more work. That will stick out like a sore thumb, and it will not be a clear casting. So you want to continue sanding on the coarser grits until you can get that out of there. And there, hopefully you can see it a little better there. Anyway, let's continue on with the coarser grits and see if we can't get rid of that line. Well, once you are content with the amount of sanding that you have done here on our resin pour, or our turning, you can move on to the next grit. At this point in time, well, we're going to drop it down basically to 120 grit. Then we're going to sand it through 150, 220, 320, and then 400 for dry sanding. Now, one thing to remember is that in between grits, you want to use some alcohol and just clean your turning so that you can see what kind of progress you're making. And lastly here, we're just going to move on to the final dry sanding grit, which will be 400. Well, I'm not going to do an hour-long video of me sanding this. this is the final dry sanding at 400 grit, and I'm going to move through now to all the wet sanding, starting at 400 grit, then moving to 600. When I'm happy with the 600, I'm going to start using micro abrasives. And at that point in time, we're going to sand this thing right up to 12,000 grit, and that should polish it up fairly nicely. So I'm not going to run through a full video of that. I will see you guys at the end. And at this point in time, you should have something that looks like this. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut off that top part there. There's a story behind it. I'll tell you that in just a minute. But I'm going to turn a simple knob for the top of this rose and a simple base. And I'll come back and see you once I get that done. And our little, I guess we'll call it a finial. I'm not sure if that's the right term. Anyway, that will get glued right on top like that. And now with our base turned, our Enchanted rose can get glued centered on our base. Now I'm just going to put a finish of Danish oil on these walnut pieces. I really didn't want a bright shiny finish because I don't want to take away from the Enchanted rose. So I'm going to put a coat of Danish oil on each of these walnut pieces. We're going to let those dry up. We're going to glue the whole thing together, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to see it. And there you have it. An Enchanted rose resin project. Guys, this whole project right from the get-go was nothing more than an experiment. I didn't know if it would work, and I didn't know if the clay would react with the resin. I didn't know, well, you know what, I didn't know a lot of things. But how will you know unless you try? Now, although I'm quite happy with the results, there are a few things that I would have done a little differently. And basically, remember earlier when I said there's a story behind it? Well, what the story is that I guess I didn't think the whole project through in my mind. And when I poured the first coat of resin with the petals in the bottom, I never thought to give myself enough material there, enough resin material, to give myself enough to mount it on the lathe. What I would have really liked to do with this was use a collet chuck on the inside, get a nice secure mounting, but instead what happened was I was left with nothing to work with, and I went with the double-sided tape method. Now, because of that, I ended up having to use a tailstock. And the more I turned, the more problems I got into because, well, for starters, my tailstock, my headstock somehow loosened up. I don't know how that happened. And then on top of that, I got a couple catches which popped the hold of the double-sided tape. Now, if you've ever done any kind of turning and turned for a while and then removed it and tried to put it back on and get it centered just by playing with it, you know darn well it doesn't go very well in a lot of cases. And that was my problem here. So because of that, long story, right? So because of that, I ended up having to leave the tailstock in place to help stabilize the piece and help hold it in place until I could get the polishing and that sort of thing done. Hence why I had to turn the little top finial on the top. So if I had it back, I would have given myself more material there to work with to get a more secure mounting. I would have also poured this whole thing in one single pour. Depending on what light you look at this in, you can see the dividing line in the two pours, and that's unfortunate because it would have been nice to have it solid and give that illusion of it floating. And although it's still not too bad, I think it could have been a lot better. And I think that could have been obtained by using a resin clear rod to hold the rows up, glue everything together, and doing it in one solid pour. How do you get a clear resin rod? Simple. You fill a plastic drinking straw and there is your rod. Just cut it to length and use resin to glue the rest of the stuff in place. And guys, this project is a load of fun. There's so many aspects here that you could delve into with the modeling clay, the polymer clay, and the resins, the turning, then the wood turning. The whole process is just a blast. But when it comes to polishing that resin, I found once you get down to the micro meshes, I would set a timer for 3 minutes, and at each individual grit, I would work on that turning for 3 full minutes on those grits. I would give it more if I wanted it or if I thought it needed it, but I would not do less than 3 minutes. So there's an idea for you. Just make sure it's a small turning. Enchanted roses. What are you gonna do? Guys, I hope you've enjoyed today's show. I've had a lot of fun with this one. I love this experimenting thing and, end up having a product that looks like the one that we got today. It's just a satisfying experience. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the bell so that you don't miss the notifications of future episodes of my show. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this show. I hope you've enjoyed the series and the project. I hope you're going to give this a try for yourself. And I honestly hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another Alternative Tuesdays.